She grabbed my wrist when I picked up the phone to call the lab. Not a gentle touch. A grip. Both hands, fingers tight. The way you hold on to something you're afraid of losing over the edge of something high. I'm Ryan. I'm 36 years old. I teach high school history. And until that moment, standing in our kitchen on a Wednesday evening with a referral slip from the pediatrician in my other hand, I had believed, with the specific confidence of a man who has never been given a reason to doubt, that I knew exactly who my wife was. "Please," Angela said, "please don't do this." I looked at her hands on my wrist. I looked at her face. She was 33 years old, and I had known her for 8 years and loved her for most of them. And what I saw in her expression in that moment was not the fear of a woman being wrongly accused. It was something else, something that sat deeper and knew more. "Why?" I said. She didn't answer. And the silence that followed that question, for seconds, maybe 5, in our kitchen with the referral slip in my hand and her fingers on my wrist, and the sound of Mason playing in the next room, was the loudest thing I had ever heard in my life. Mason was 4 years old. He had Angela's dark eyes and a laugh that filled every room he entered, and a habit of collecting smooth stones from the driveway and lining them up on the windowsill in order of size. He was the best thing in my life. He had been the best thing in my life since the day Angela called me from the hospital bathroom, voice shaking, to tell me the test was positive. I set the phone down. I didn't make the call that night, but I already knew, in the wordless, structural way that certain truths arrive before you're willing to name them, that the call was coming, and that what it would tell me had already been true for 4 years, sitting in the silence between us, waiting for the moment I finally stopped choosing not to hear it. Let me tell you who Angela was to me before that Wednesday, because she deserves to be described accurately. The real person, not the aftermath. We met in the summer of 2016 at a backyard birthday party for a mutual friend. She was sitting on a lawn chair reading a novel with the focused determination of someone who had decided to enjoy the party on her own terms, and I found that immediately compelling. We talked for 3 hours. She was warm and funny and had a specific kind of directness that I mistook, for a long time, for transparency. I understand the difference now. We dated for 2 years and married in September 2018. We bought a small house in Crestwood, the kind of town where the hardware store still knows your name and the high school football games draw half the population on Friday nights. Angela worked as a graphic designer, freelance mostly, from a studio space she'd set up in the spare bedroom. The arrangement suited her independence and suited the life we'd built. Mason arrived in March 2020, in the particular strange suspended atmosphere of that spring, when the world had narrowed to the dimensions of a house and the people inside it. He was born healthy and loud and immediately essential. I remember holding him in the hospital room while Angela slept, looking at his face and feeling the specific, vertiginous weight of a love that has no floor. The first year of his life was the hardest and the best. Angela was a devoted mother. I want to say that plainly, because it's true and because it matters. Whatever else she was or wasn't, she was present and attentive and genuine with Mason in a way that required no performance. That was real. My blind spot, in those years, was a form of idealism I had never fully examined. I had built a version of Angela in my mind, assembled from the best of what I'd seen, smoothed of contradiction, consistent and knowable, and I returned to that version whenever evidence suggested something more complicated. Not consciously, not as a decision I made deliberately each time. More like a reflex, the mental equivalent of writing a picture frame every time it tilts. I kept her image level. I kept it familiar. I did not ask what was behind it. The first thing I noticed, and didn't examine, was a name. Brandon. He came up in conversation twice in the first 2 years of our marriage, always briefly, always in the context of Angela's college years. An ex-boyfriend, she'd said once. They'd dated seriously for about a year. It had ended badly. She didn't think about him much. She said it with the particular casualness of someone who had rehearsed the casual version of a complicated thing. I accepted the rehearsed version. I had no framework for the complicated one. The second thing I noticed was a shift in Angela's behavior in the months around Mason's conception, roughly the autumn of 2019. She had been traveling more than usual for client work. 2 trips to Indianapolis, 1 to Chicago, each one explained clearly and plausibly. She came back from the Chicago trip quieter than she'd left. Not unhappy, just internally occupied in a way I attributed to work stress and left alone. Looking back now, the Chicago trip was the detail I should have examined. I didn't examine it because examining it would have required me to question the version of Angela I had built, and I was not ready to do that. I had invested too much in the picture to want to look behind the frame. Joel, my closest friend since college, had a reaction to Angela that I'd always mildly noted and never pursued. Not hostility. Joel was too careful for that. Just a consistent slight reserve, a watchfulness he dropped into whenever her name came up. Once, early in our marriage, he'd started to say something and then stopped and changed the subject. I let him change it. I should have asked him to finish the sentence. The pediatrician's referral slip arrived because of a routine blood typing discrepancy. Mason had gone in for a standard checkup in October, and the new pediatrician, we'd switched after Dr. Ellison retired, had flagged an inconsistency in the blood type records from his birth. Not alarming, she said. Probably a transcription error, but worth confirming, particularly given some of the family medical history questions she'd been updating. She'd written up a referral for a simple blood panel. I mentioned it to Angela that evening over dinner. She went very still. Not the stillness of someone processing information, the stillness of someone managing a response. It's probably just the records being wrong, she said. You know how disorganized Dr. Ellison's office was. Probably, I said. The new doctor just wants to confirm. I don't think it's necessary, Angela said. Mason's healthy. I don't want to put him through a blood draw for a paperwork error. I looked at her across the dinner table, Mason between us, eating with the focused intensity he brought to everything. And something in me shifted. Not suspicion, not yet. Something quieter. A question that didn't have words yet, but had weight. I didn't say anything else about it that night. But I didn't put the referral slip away either. I left it on the counter. And over the next 3 days I watched Angela's eyes go to it every time she passed through the kitchen, the way your eyes go to something you're trying not to look at. On the Wednesday, 4 days after the pediatrician's visit, I picked up the phone. She grabbed my wrist and said, "Please don't do this," and didn't answer when I asked why. After I set the phone down that night, I went for a long walk. Crestwood in October is a particular kind of quiet. Leaves down, air sharp, the neighborhood's emptied by early dark. I walked for 40 minutes and thought about blood types. I am type O. I had known this since a blood drive in college. Angela is type A. She'd mentioned it once in a medical context, years ago. Mason's chart, according to the new pediatrician's flag, listed him as type AB. I had been a history teacher for 11 years. I was not a geneticist, but I had enough basic biology to know that 2 parents with types O and A could not produce a child with type AB. I stood on a sidewalk in Crestwood, Indiana, in the October dark, and understood something that I had been given every possible signal to understand for 4 years. Something hadn't broken inside me in that moment. It had gone very, very quiet. I called Joel the next morning from my car before school. "I need to ask you something," I said, "and I need you to tell me the truth, even if you think it'll hurt me." A pause. "Okay. Did you ever have a reason to doubt Angela? Specifically, did you ever know something you didn't tell me?" The pause this time was longer. "Ryan," he said carefully, "what's happening? Just answer." He exhaled slowly. "A few months before Mason was born," he said, "I ran into someone at a bar in Indianapolis. A guy I vaguely knew from your and Angela's social circle. He mentioned seeing Angela there, in Indianapolis, with someone. A guy. He said they seemed close." Another pause. I told myself it was probably nothing. A client, a friend. I didn't want to. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because you were happy," Joel said quietly. "And I wasn't certain. And I told myself I was probably wrong." I thanked him. I got off the phone. I sat in the school parking lot for 10 minutes before I went inside. That was the moment, I think now, when the last version of my old life ended. Not the Wednesday in the kitchen. Not the test results, which hadn't come yet. This moment, sitting in a car outside the school where I taught other people's children about cause and consequence. Understanding that the people closest to me had been carrying half-truths on my behalf for years because I had made it too costly, emotionally, to tell me the whole one. I had not been deceived only by Angela. I had been protected from the truth by everyone who cared about me because my investment in a particular version of my life had been so visible that no one had wanted to be the one to disturb it. That was the realization that went deepest, not the betrayal from outside, the one I had quietly invited. I made the call on a Thursday, not impulsively. I had spent 2 days in a state of careful, cold deliberateness that I barely recognized in myself. I am not, ordinarily, a cold person. But something had shifted in the quality of my thinking, a new precision that came from having no more versions of the story left to prefer. I simply needed the facts. All of them, whatever they were. The DNA test was a straightforward paternity kit available through a medical lab in Indianapolis. The pediatrician's referral provided the clinical justification. I didn't need Angela's involvement for the blood panel that had been recommended, and the lab could run paternity confirmation from the same sample. I brought Mason in on a Thursday afternoon, telling Angela it was the follow-up appointment the doctor had requested. She asked to come. I told her I had it handled. She stood in the hallway when we left and watched us go with an expression I didn't let myself interpret. The results would take 5 to 7 business days. I spent those days teaching the French Revolution to juniors who were moderately interested and grading papers that I processed without much conscious thought and coming home to a house that had taken on a specific atmospheric quality, the quality of two people who are both waiting for the same thing and neither is acknowledging it. Angela was careful with me, attentive in a way she hadn't been in months. She cooked dinners she knew I liked. She was present with Mason in the evenings with a focused warmth that felt, in context, like someone making an argument without words. I was not unmoved by it. That's important to say. The part of me that had loved her for 8 years was not simply switched off by what I now knew. It ran alongside everything else, the grief and the anger and the cold deliberateness, like a parallel track that hadn't yet been officially decommissioned. My mother, Diane, called midweek. She had always had an antenna for my emotional state that I'd never fully explained and had long since stopped trying to evade. She asked how I was, and I said fine, and she said, "Ryan, what's wrong?" I told her. All of it. The blood type, the referral, Joel's account of Indianapolis, the Wednesday in the kitchen. She was quiet for a long time. "Whatever the results say," she said finally, "Mason is your son. You've been his father for 4 years. That doesn't change." I knew that. I had known it before she said it. But hearing it said, by the person who had known me longest, did something necessary. It separated the two things that had been tangled in my chest, the question of what Angela had done and the question of who Mason was to me. They were related but not identical, and I needed them to be separate before the results arrived. On the 6th day, I opened the email from the lab. I sat at the kitchen table, the same table where the referral slip had sat, where Angela had watched it from across the room for 4 days, and I read the results. The probability of paternity, 0%. I closed the laptop. I sat in the quiet kitchen for a long time. Mason was at preschool. Angela was in her studio. The house made its ordinary sounds. The refrigerator hum, a car passing outside, the particular creak of the second stair that I'd been meaning to fix for 2 years. Then I called Patricia, the same family attorney Sandra had used, whose name I'd kept in my contacts after their divorce last year because, I suppose, some part of me had understood that I might need it someday. The call lasted 20 minutes. Then I went and knocked on Angela's studio door. She opened the door with a pencil behind her ear and a distracted expression that cleared the moment she saw my face. I held up my phone. The email was open on the screen. She looked at it. She looked at me. The pencil fell from behind her ear, and neither of us moved to pick it up. "Come out of the studio," I said. "I think we should sit down." We sat at the kitchen table, the same chairs we always sat in. The afternoon light came through the garden window the way it always did. Everything in the kitchen was exactly the same as it had been that morning, and nothing in it was the same at all. I set the phone on the table between us, screen up, results visible. "Tell me about Brandon," I said. She closed her eyes. What followed was not a scene. There was no shouting, no broken crockery, no theatrical collapse. We are both, fundamentally, people who process inward rather than outward, and the conversation that happened at that table was conducted in the quiet, exhausted register of two people who have run out of the energy required to perform their emotions. She told me about Brandon in the flat, careful voice of someone dismantling a structure they built themselves. They had dated in college for almost 2 years. It had ended when he'd moved away, not cleanly, not completely, the way things end when both people still feel the pull, but the logistics have made continuation impossible. They had stayed loosely in contact over the years. Occasional messages. The specific low-level maintenance of a connection neither person is willing to formally close. In the autumn of 2019, he had come through Indianapolis for work. She had been there for a client. They had dinner. One dinner became 2 nights. She had known, she said, almost immediately that something might be wrong. She had done the same arithmetic I had done on the sidewalk in October. She knew her blood type, she knew mine, and she had spent 4 years managing the knowledge the way you manage a structural fault you've decided not to report. Quietly, constantly, with increasing cost. Why didn't you tell me? I said. Because I didn't want to lose you, she said. And Mason. And everything. So instead you let me be his father without knowing. She didn't answer that directly. There was no answer that helped. Does Brandon know? I asked. A pause. I told him when Mason was born. He said he wasn't in a position to be involved. He has a family. She looked at her hands. He wanted it to stay the way it was. I sat with that. Brandon had a family. Brandon had known for 4 years that a child existed who was biologically his, and had made the decision, presumably a comfortable one, from a distance, that the existing arrangements suited him fine. That I would raise his child, love his child, build my life around his child, without knowing. The anger I felt in that moment was the cleanest emotion I'd had since the Wednesday in the kitchen. Clear and specific and without ambiguity. I need you to understand something, I said, and I heard my own voice as steady as I'd ever heard it. Mason is my son. That is not negotiable, and it is not changing. I have been his father for 4 years, and I will be his father for the rest of his life. That is the one thing in this conversation that is settled. Angela was crying, quietly, without drama. But I can't stay in this marriage, I said. Not because of the test. Because of 4 years of knowing and saying nothing. Because of the Wednesday when you grabbed my wrist and begged me not to find out the truth about my own family. She nodded. Like she'd known this was the sentence waiting at the end of the conversation. Like she'd known it for 4 years. What happens to Mason? She asked. We both love him, I said. We figure that out like adults. That part we do together. She nodded again. I stood up. I picked up my phone. I stepped over the pencil on the floor. Neither of us had moved to pick it up, and I left it there. And I walked out of the kitchen and up the stairs and sat on the edge of my bed and looked at the wall for a long time. I didn't feel relief. I didn't feel triumph. I felt the particular, bone-deep exhaustion of a man who has finally put down something very heavy that he carried for a very long time without knowing he was carrying it. The divorce took 8 months. We were, in the end, civil about it, not because there was no pain, but because Mason sat at the center of every decision and neither of us was willing to let our damage become his. We agreed on joint custody without significant conflict. Angela moved into a smaller place across town. I kept the house, the windowsill stones still lined up in their careful sequence, the second stairs still creaking. I told Mason, when he was old enough to begin asking questions in the way children do, indirectly, through analogies and comparisons, and the specific curiosity of a 5-year-old trying to map the world, that families come in different shapes. That some children have their parents in 2 houses. That having 2 houses didn't mean half a family. It meant a family that had found a different geometry. He seemed to find this satisfactory. Children are more adaptable than we give them credit for, and more perceptive than we prefer. Joel came over the first weekend after Angela moved out. We watched a game I don't remember and ate food I don't remember and didn't talk about any of it for most of the evening. Near the end of the night, he said, I should have told you. In Indianapolis. I should have just told you. You weren't certain, I said. I wasn't willing to be certain, he said. That's different. I appreciated the precision of that. It was the same distinction I'd been making about myself. Diane came for a week in the spring. She cooked and organized things that didn't need organizing and spent long afternoons on the back porch with Mason, teaching him the names of the birds that came to the feeder she'd bought and installed without asking. On her last evening, she sat with me in the kitchen and said, You're going to be fine. I know, I said. I mean it specifically, she said. Not as encouragement. As an observation. She was right, as she usually was. The fineness arrived the way it always does. Not as a moment, but as a gradual accumulation of ordinary days that stop feeling like recovery and start feeling like just days. Mason's laugh filling the house. Long runs on Sunday mornings. Cooking properly again. Reading in the evenings without the low-frequency hum of unexamined things beneath the surface. I heard about Brandon obliquely, about a year after the divorce, through a mutual acquaintance who didn't know the full story. His marriage had run into difficulties. His wife had found out about Angela. Not from me, not from Angela, but in the way these things eventually find their way out, through some chain of disclosure I was never fully informed of. He was dealing with the consequences of 4 years of comfortable distance from a truth he'd chosen not to engage with. I didn't feel satisfaction about that either. Just a quiet recognition of the way accountability eventually finds its address, even when the recipient has moved. The thing I think about most, when I think about those 6 years, is not the betrayal. It's the idealism. The specific, costly habit I had of maintaining a preferred version of the people I loved over the actual version, of choosing the picture I wanted over the evidence that complicated it. It had felt, for years, like a form of loyalty. I understand now that it was a form of avoidance dressed in loyalty's clothing. Mason put a new stone on the windowsill last week, a gray one with a white stripe, found at the edge of the school parking lot. He placed it at the end of the line with great deliberateness and then stood back and evaluated the sequence. "Does it fit?" I asked him. He considered it seriously. "It fits," he said. "It's just different from the others." He went back to whatever he was doing. I stood looking at the stone for a moment longer than necessary. Different from the others. But it fits. That felt like enough of a lesson for one evening. What this story ultimately reveals is not simply the mechanics of deception, though those are present and documented, but something more uncomfortable. The way two people can participate, from entirely different positions, in the same sustained untruth. Angela's deception was active and deliberate. She made choices, in Indianapolis, in the months of the pregnancy, across 4 years of silence, that were driven by a recognizable human fear. She could not let go of Brandon because he represented something unresolved in her, some version of herself that existed before she became a wife and mother, and the collision of that unresolved past with her present life produced not honesty, but management. She managed the situation the way people manage things they cannot afford to examine, carefully, quietly, and at increasing cost to everyone around her. But Ryan's participation in the untruth was real, even if it was unconscious. The idealism he carried, the constructed version of Angela that he maintained against evidence, was not neutral. It was a choice, repeated across years, to invest in a particular image rather than a particular person. The image was consistent and comfortable, and it told him what he wanted to know. The person was more complicated and less convenient, and required the kind of attention he had never fully committed to paying. This is the dynamic that sits at the heart of many long betrayals. One person deceives actively, and the other person, without knowing, without intending, makes the deception easier by declining to look too closely. Ryan's conflict avoidance and emotional idealism did not cause Angela's choices, but they created a landscape in which those choices could persist for years without detection. She was not working against an attentive, questioning partner. She was working against a man who had decided, philosophically, that love meant not requiring proof. The figure of Brandon illuminates something the story doesn't linger on but shouldn't be passed over. He knew. From the moment Mason was born, he possessed information that Ryan was being denied, information about his own child, his own family, his own life, and he made the calculation that distance was preferable to disclosure. His eventual consequences arrive off-page, but they arrive. This is the story's karma structure. The comfortable distance Brandon maintained collapsed when the truth found its own way out, through channels no one controlled. Deception doesn't require exposure to become unsustainable. It accumulates weight on its own, and eventually that weight finds a crack. What Ryan ultimately builds from the wreckage is modest and durable, a more accurate way of seeing. Not cynicism. He remains, clearly, a man capable of deep attachment and genuine love, but a willingness to test what he believes against what is actually there, to ask the question rather than protect the answer, to understand that trust which has never been tested is closer to assumption than to faith. Mason remains at the center of everything, the child who is both the evidence of the betrayal and entirely separate from it. Ryan's insistence, in the confrontation scene, that Mason is his son regardless of biology is not denial. It is the clearest-eyed thing he says in the entire story. Love that has been built through 4 years of daily presence is not invalidated by a test result. That distinction, between biological fact and relational truth is perhaps the most important one the story makes. What I keep returning to, thinking about this story, is that moment on the sidewalk in October when Ryan does the blood type math and understands, fully, completely, what it means, and then goes home and doesn't say anything, and waits 2 more days before picking up the phone. I don't think that was weakness. I think that was a man giving himself the last few hours of a life he recognized before walking into one he didn't. There's something deeply human about that pause. We all have moments where we're standing at the edge of a truth we can't unknow, and we take one last look at the version of things we're about to leave behind. The question isn't whether to eventually pick up the phone. The question is, how long have you been standing at that edge, telling yourself the math probably adds up fine?